In Sydney, Australia, on the banks of Darling Harbour, a team of archaeologists investigating the development corridor for a new railway station for Sydney Metro made a very unusual discovery. Buried in the sands near an old seawall and dock, they unearthed what appeared to be a large collection of aged timbers. This was the start of an intriguing maritime mystery and epic journey of discovery that continues to this day.
So a lot of people were going onto the site at the time, and specialists, maritime archaeologists, to have a look at what we have here in the ground. And I know that as soon as I stepped onto the site and I saw it, and I just felt this is something special here.
In the early days of the colony, the waters around Sydney Harbour were a hive of lively marine activity. On the foreshore, wharves, slipways and shipyards dominated the landscape as commercial trade took hold. As the team carefully brushed away layers of silt and mud from the timbers, it became apparent they had exposed the wooden remains of a boat that had rested unknown and untouched for nearly 2 centuries. In keeping with the tradition of naming discoveries after the location they are found, the wreck was officially named Unidentified Darling Harbour Boat 1, and it became simply known as the Barangaroo boat. Leading the fieldwork team was maritime archaeologist Cosmos Koronios.
The reason we've got this vessel here is because it was dragged ashore near a boatyard and just left to decay until it got buried. So it's a very rare find.
In the first part of the 19th century, most of the boats plying the waterways of Sydney Harbour and its surrounding coastal and riverine settlements would have been constructed from local timber and materials. Ships from overseas, by contrast, were built from predominantly European timber. So, was the recently unearthed vessel from overseas, or could it have been built right here in Australia?
At site, what we did was we took a few samples of some timbers, because it was definitely British looking, but was it Australian timber?
After an agonising few weeks, the results came in. The timbers were Sydney blue gum, spotted gum with some grey gum and Banksia.
The results came back that yes, it was local timber to around here, so that was very exciting as well.
Where we are at the moment is at the stern of the vessel, or the back end of the vessel. The timber that you can see closest to you is the stern post, the back end of where the rudder would have been attached on the vessel. And here you're seeing all the frames that made up the hull. Some of these timbers have been really roughly cut.
Instead of having steam bent ribs, it had, branches for frames, and you could still see the branch in it.
Even though the boat was quite small and built simply, it probably would have braved the seas outside Sydney Heads in open water.
This would have been a small coastal trader. It would have worked around Sydney, probably gone up to Hawkesbury, maybe down to Shoalhaven.
Coastal traders were a common boat in the early days of the colony and were often small vessels of less than 50 tonnes. Many would have been clinker-built, meaning the planks were overlapped, and were best suited for shallow coastal waters and rivers where they were used to transport supplies.
We've recorded every timber in position. We put a new tag on it that will stay with it its whole conservation life.
With the excavation of the boat nearly complete, the timbers needed to be carefully packed before the next stage of the conservation process could begin.
The biggest danger to the wreck in terms of its being reassembled is if they dry out and they start warping. So keeping them wet and then in the refrigerator means that they stay wet longer until such time as we get them into a tank full of water and start treating them.
Piece by piece, the timbers of the boat were carried into refrigerated containers and stowed away for their first voyage in nearly 200 years. As the containers arrived at a facility in Western Sydney, members of the Silent World Foundation, who specialise in maritime heritage and archaeology, set to work.
This sort of work hasn't been done in Australia in over 30 years, and it has never been done on Australian timber shipwreck.
We've got these big containers here, they're refrigerated, and everything has been wrapped up in like a wet fabric, which has then been put in plastic, so it's kept it wet for about a year now. What we're then doing is we're taking it out, photographing the pieces of wood. We're putting them in the tank when they're waiting to be cleaned because it needs to be kept wet. If it dries out, it's going to crumble. So you just want to go really slowly because some of the wood is quite soft. You don't want to accidentally dig that out and take out any information.
We clean all the silt off, and then the conservators will look at it and make a decision about what sort of treatment should be applied. Before the treatment takes place though, we do go over to the recording area where we scan it and produce a 3D model so that we can capture its shape just as it came out.
As the Silent World team continued their work, Thomas van Dam, a specialist in underwater archaeology from Belgium, began 3D scanning the timbers of the boat.
I'm making a very accurate 3D scan of one of the timbers, and what this information will do is it gives us the shape and the geometry and the texture of the timber. Eventually we will have a 3D scan of every timber on the wreck, so we can use that data to kind of reconstruct the vessel digitally. We also have it for documentation purposes, so we'll be using these scans to look at where the nails are, the trenails are, and that will tell us about the construction sequence of the ship. It kind of gives us a deep dive into the archaeological record.
Ian Panter from the York Archaeological Trust in England joined the team to examine and analyse the condition of the timbers.
We need to do a sort of an assessment of the condition so we can work out the precise conservation regime that the timbers will need. We're used to oaks and ash, things like that, whereas here they're using the local eucalyptus type wood, so we have to factor that into the process as well.
The first step was to get a baseline on the condition and potential threats to the wreck.
It is quite well preserved. Using this device we can get decay profiles through the wood and see how well preserved the wood is, which is not something we would normally see with the naked eye.
Come on in, please, Kieran.
Great, thanks, Jane.
Let me show the artefacts
Wow,
associated with the
look
boat.
at this.
While the boat itself was being treated, maritime archaeologist Kieran Hosty has come to examine some of the diverse artefacts that were found buried in and around the boat.
We're looking at a very early vessel here. We think it's one of the earliest colonial-built vessels in Australia. It is a major find. It is nothing like I've ever seen in boat building.
We found artefacts inside the boat that may be associated with the boat and the boatyard, but we also found hundreds of artefacts sitting in the sand around the boat that would have been under the boat, but also built up over the time once the boat was abandoned.
This one was found sitting in the boat.
I'm intrigued. Is it a whale
This is
tooth?
a sperm whale tooth.
Sperm whale tooth.
Yes.
We can use this information to actually help date the vessel. When it first got pulled up onto the bank, when the vessel was in use, and hopefully what happened to the vessel afterwards.
Archaeologist Jane Rook has the mammoth task of cataloguing all the artefacts.
We've got a range of different types of artefacts from the boat, so as you would expect, the artefacts in the boat, around the boat, associated with the boat, a lot of them are boat building related. But then we've also got the personal artefacts and the plates and the marbles and the kids' toys and the shoes and things that aren't related to boats.
Artefacts and stories of everyday people tend not to survive through the ages. So this discovery was a Sydney waterfront time capsule.
So I love finding new little things that I've never seen before, trying to figure out why they're there and who left them and how they were repaired, and just those little minute details about people's lives that you're not told in the history books.
Back at the Western Sydney facility, The timbers of the boat have been returned to the treatment tanks and are about to embark on the next phase of their conservation journey.
The chemical phase that we're going through right now is to remove the iron that causes problems in the short term and the long term conservation of this boat.
Lessons learned from previous shipwreck conservation projects show that iron appears to be one of many causative factors in the formation of sulfuric acid when PEG conservation methods are used. Therefore, it's important to remove as much of the iron as possible from the timbers before the PEG treatment.
The timbers are waterlogged. So what is actually keeping these cells in their shape is water. We need to replace that water with something else, and that's where the polyethylene glycol wax comes in.
Oh, we need to pull that in? Yeah, let's start with that.
These timbers will sit in the polyethylene glycol and they will slowly start taking up, we call it PEG wax. And then eventually, when it is time to take them out, there will be minimal changing of the wood because instead of water bulking it out, it's now polyethylene glycol wax.
Once the polyethylene glycol had done its job, the solution was pumped from the tanks and the timbers were carefully boxed in preparation for the next process: vacuum freeze drying. The boat's voyage of conservation has brought it to Melbourne, where members of the Silent World Foundation and Steamatic carefully remove the timbers from the containers and prepare them for the vacuum freeze drying process.
So the difficulty with this job is they needed the freeze drying done minus the heat, because the heat would affect their process from the PEG bath that they were in, which puts a wax structure through the timber.
The freeze drying process usually involves a heating phase, but that couldn't be used here. Temperatures above 60 degrees Celsius can cause degradation of PEG, which can be another factor that impacts sulfuric acid production. This meant the process would take longer, as all the water needed to be removed from the timbers via sublimation, and no heat could be added to the process to speed it along.
The freeze drying removes the excess water from the timbers in the way that is safest for the timbers in terms of their aesthetic appearance, so it causes the least amount of shrinking and warping, and it's also the safest for them structurally as well.
With the freeze drying mission accomplished, the timbers are again packed safely away for their journey to Sydney, where their ongoing care is entrusted to the team at the Australian National Maritime Museum. Since its discovery, the wreck has revealed many secrets from Sydney's maritime past. But as the research and conservation continues, it raises even deeper questions. Among them, is the Barangaroo boat truly the right name for the wreck?
And there's just so many avenues to explore, to research in this boat. Not only how it was made or who made it, but how it operated, who was involved in its life, and also how it ended. Why was it beached? When was it abandoned? Those sorts of questions. So it's a great detective story, and I know just talking with some people, they may think, well, it's just an old boat. Then you start talking about it more and they start to get intrigued about those questions, and they start to think of questions themselves. And before they know it, they've caught the bug.